I choose her. The pureblood bride who carries a powerful name. Not the Omega everyone forgot. The words echoed through the Moonspire Hall, and Claire Whitmore felt the world around her become strangely silent. The crystal chandeliers above her still shimmered, the musicians still held their instruments, and hundreds of wolves still watched from their seats, but all she could hear was the slow, painful rhythm of her own heartbeat. Tonight was supposed to be the night she finally belonged. She had spent years believing that kindness, loyalty, and patience would mean something. She had believed Ethan Blackwood saw the person beneath the Omega label. But standing across from her in the grand hall, his hand resting gently over Victoria Ashford's, Claire finally understood the truth. He had never been choosing her. Ethan lifted his chin, his expression filled with the confidence of an alpha heir. Victoria is a pureblood. She was born to stand beside power. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some looked away with discomfort. Others whispered behind their hands. Claire lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the small silver pendant she had worn since childhood. It was the only thing she had left from her mother, a reminder that her worth had never depended on someone else's approval. Victoria stepped forward in a gown of deep blue silk, every movement graceful and perfect. "Claire, you should understand," she said softly, though her words carried across the hall. "Some people are meant to support greatness, not share it." The sentence was gentle, but it cut deeper than anger ever could. Claire remembered every moment she had stood beside Ethan. Every time she healed the wounded after training. Every time she helped families in the village. Every time she gave without expecting anything in return. Yet none of those moments mattered in a world that valued bloodlines above hearts. The ceremony continued without her. The crowd celebrated a future that no longer included Claire Whitmore. She walked away from the lights, away from the music, and away from the only home she had ever known. Outside the hall, the cold night air touched her face. The moon hung above. The forest like a silent witness, silver and endless. Claire stopped beneath the ancient trees and finally allowed herself to breathe. She was hurt. She was disappointed. But somewhere beneath the sadness, something stronger remained. She had lost the person who refused to see her value. She had not lost herself. What Claire did not know was that beyond the northern mountains, in a kingdom wrapped in mystery and old legends, another ruler had already heard her name. Alexander Ravencrest, the Shadow King, the man every alpha respected and every rival feared, had been searching for someone with a rare kind of strength. Not the strength of a warrior. Not the strength of a crown. The strength to remain kind in a world that had given her every reason not to be. And before the next moon rose, the Omega everyone abandoned would step into a destiny no one saw coming. The morning after the ceremony felt strangely unfamiliar to Claire Whitmore. The same village paths she had walked for years looked different now, as if every stone and every tree carried the memory of the night she had been left behind. She packed only what she could carry in a small leather bag. A few dresses, her mother's silver pendant, and the old journal where she had written down every dream she once believed would come true. There was no anger in her heart. That surprised even her. She had expected bitterness to take over, but instead, there was only a quiet emptiness and a small voice inside reminding her that her story was not finished. As Claire walked through Silver Moon-packed territory for the last time, she passed the healing house where she had spent countless hours helping others. The elderly, the injured, the young wolves who struggled to control their shifting abilities. She had never asked for recognition. She had only wanted to make someone's difficult day a little easier. But kindness was often invisible until the moment someone finally understood its value. "Leaving already?" a familiar voice called behind her. Claire turned and saw Ethan's younger sister, Amelia Blackwood, standing near the garden entrance. Unlike the others, Amelia had never laughed at her. Her expression held sadness, not judgment. "I thought you would stay and fight for your place," Amelia said softly. Claire gave a small smile. A place that disappears the moment someone decides I am not enough was never truly mine. Amelia looked down, unable to answer. Those words carried more strength than any argument could have. Claire continued toward the forest path, but before she reached the boundary, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Ethan. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man who had once promised to protect her now looked uncertain. "Claire," he said quietly, "I wanted to explain." She looked at him, and for the first time she did not see the person she had loved. She saw someone who had chosen a different path. "You do not have to explain why you chose someone else," Claire replied. "Everyone has the right to choose their future." Ethan lowered his eyes. "You are not angry?" Claire looked toward the distant mountains where the morning sunlight touched the peaks. "I was hurt, but I will not spend my life proving my worth to someone who already decided not to see it." Those words stayed with Ethan long after she walked away. Claire crossed beyond the borders of Silver Moon Pack and entered the quiet northern forest. The journey was long, but for the first time in years, every step belonged only to her. She did not know where she would go. She did not know what waited beyond the mountains. But deep within the Northern Kingdom, a message had already reached the stone halls of Ravencrest Castle. A forgotten Omega had walked away from rejection with dignity instead of hatred. And when Alexander Ravencrest heard her name, the Shadow King did something no one expected. He ordered his advisors to find Claire Whitmore. Not because of her bloodline, not because of her status, but because he had heard of the one thing his kingdom needed most. A heart strong enough to remain gentle in a world that had tried to break it. The northern road was colder than Claire Whitmore expected. The farther she traveled from Silver Moon Pack, the quieter the world became. The familiar voices of judgment faded behind her, replaced by the sound of wind moving through the tall pine trees and the soft rhythm of her own footsteps. For the first time in years, she was alone without feeling forgotten. She was alone because she had chosen herself. After 3 days of traveling, Claire reached a small village at the edge of the Northern Territories. It was not a wealthy place. The wooden homes were simple, and the streets were quiet, but the people carried a warmth she had not felt in a long time. When they learned she was a healer, they welcomed her without asking about her bloodline. No one cared that she was an Omega. They only cared that she was willing to help. Claire spent her days tending to small injuries, comforting worried families, and listening to stories from people who had spent their lives unseen. Slowly, the heaviness in her heart began to disappear. But far beyond the village, inside the walls of Ravencrest Castle, a different story was unfolding. Alexander Ravencrest stood beside the tall windows of the royal chamber, looking over the endless northern forests. The kingdom below respected him. They followed his commands. They feared disappointing him. But respect was not the same as understanding. For years, Alexander had searched for someone who could see beyond the crown. Someone who did not look at him as a symbol of power or a name written in history books. His advisors had presented him with countless names. Noble families, pureblood descendants, powerful alliances. Yet every suggestion felt empty. "Your Majesty," his royal advisor said carefully, placing a report on the table. "The Omega from Silver Moon Pack has crossed into the northern lands." Alexander looked down at the parchment. Claire Whitmore. A name he had heard only once, but one that somehow remained in his thoughts. "What makes her different?" he asked. The advisor hesitated. She was rejected during the choosing ceremony. Her former mate selected a pureblood bride instead. But witnesses say she left without anger. She helped others even after being humiliated. Alexander was silent. Many people could be kind when life was easy. Few could remain kind when life was unfair. He picked up the parchment and studied the simple details written about Claire. No powerful family. No famous bloodline. No political influence. Only a record of compassion and quiet courage. "Find her," Alexander said. The advisor looked surprised. "For what purpose, Your Majesty?" Alexander turned back toward the window. The moonlight reflected across the cold stone walls of the castle. Because a kingdom does not need someone who only knows how to stand beside power. It needs someone who understands the people living beneath it. Meanwhile, Claire had no idea that the most powerful alpha in the world had learned her name. She was sitting beside a small village fireplace, sharing a meal with strangers who had become friends. An elderly woman placed a warm cup of tea in front of her and smiled. "You look different tonight." Claire glanced up. "Different?" The woman nodded. "Like someone who finally stopped waiting for another person to tell her she matters." Claire looked into the gentle glow of the fire and felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. But the next morning, when a royal carriage arrived at the village gates bearing the symbol of Ravencrest Castle, Claire's peaceful new life changed forever. The world that once turned away from her was about to discover what happened when the person they rejected was chosen by a king. The royal carriage arrived at the village gates just as the morning mist began to disappear beneath the first rays of sunlight. Claire Whitmore stood among the villagers, watching the black and silver emblem of Ravencrest Castle move closer. She did not need anyone to explain who had sent it. The symbol of the Shadow King was known throughout every territory. A symbol of power. A symbol of mystery. A symbol that made even experienced alphas speak with caution. The villagers stepped aside as the carriage stopped. A royal messenger descended and approached Claire with a respectful bow. "Claire Whitmore?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes." The messenger held out a sealed letter. "By order of His Majesty, Alexander Ravencrest, you are invited to the Northern Castle." A quiet wave of surprise moved through the crowd. Claire looked at the letter in her hands, unsure why a king would want anything from someone like her. She had spent her entire life being told she was ordinary. Someone without a powerful family. Someone without a special bloodline. Someone who should be grateful for a place at the edge of society. Yet now the ruler of the Northern Kingdom was asking to meet her. The journey to Ravencrest Castle took nearly a full day. As Claire looked through the carriage window, she watched the landscape change from peaceful villages to towering mountains covered in evergreen forests. The castle appeared at sunset, rising above the valley like something from an old legend. It was beautiful, but it carried a quiet loneliness. Inside the grand halls, servants moved silently, and every person she passed treated her with careful respect. Not because they knew her, not because they understood her, but because the king had requested her presence. Claire was led into the royal chamber, where Alexander Ravencrest stood beside a large stone fireplace. He was different from the rumors. She had expected arrogance. She had expected someone who saw everyone beneath him. Instead, she saw a man with calm silver eyes and a presence that filled the room without effort. Alexander turned toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He had seen powerful warriors stand before him without hesitation. He had watched nobles fight for his attention. But Claire was different. She stood there with uncertainty, yet she did not pretend to be someone else. "You know who I am?" Alexander asked. Claire gave a small nod. "You are the Alpha King. And does that frighten you?" She paused before answering honestly. "I think power can be dangerous when someone uses it without compassion. But I do not believe power itself is something to fear." Something changed in Alexander's expression. It was a small moment, almost impossible to notice, but he had not expected that answer. Most people saw the crown first. Claire saw the person beneath it. "Why did you leave your pack?" he asked. Claire looked down briefly. "Because I realized I was trying to earn a place where I had already been rejected." The room became quiet. Alexander understood those words more than she knew. For years, people had respected his title but ignored the person behind it. "I have a proposal for you," he said. Claire looked up. "A proposal?" Alexander walked toward the table and placed a document before her. "I need a Luna beside me. Not someone chosen for their family name. Not someone who wants a crown. Someone who understands that strength is more than power." Claire stared at the offer, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Why me?" she whispered. Alexander looked at her with complete certainty. "Because when the world gave you every reason to become bitter, you chose to remain kind." For the first time in many days, Claire felt something she thought she had lost forever. Not the feeling of being chosen by someone else, but the feeling that perhaps she had been worthy all along. The days that followed Claire Whitmore's arrival at Ravencrest Castle felt unlike anything she had ever known. She had expected to feel like a guest waiting to be judged, but instead, she found herself surrounded by people who simply wanted to understand her. The servants greeted her with kindness. The healers asked for her advice. Even the guards who once looked only toward powerful warriors began to notice the quiet strength she carried. Still, Claire struggled to accept it. Years of being overlooked could not disappear in a single day. Every morning, she reminded herself that she was not here because she had finally become valuable. She had always been valuable. She was simply standing in a place where others could finally see it. Alexander Ravencrest watched this change from a distance. He noticed the way Claire thanked every servant by name. He noticed how she listened before speaking. He noticed that she never used his attention as a way to gain influence over others. Many people came to the castle hoping to stand closer to the throne. Claire seemed to care more about the people standing far away from it. One afternoon, Alexander invited her to walk through the eastern gardens. The garden stretched across several acres of land, filled with ancient trees and flowers that bloomed even during the colder months. Claire looked around in surprise. "This place is beautiful," she said. Alexander glanced toward the flowers. "My mother planted most of them. She believed a kingdom should have places where people could remember they were more than their duties." Claire smiled softly. "She sounds like someone who understood kindness." Alexander was quiet for a moment. Few people spoke about his family with such warmth. Most only remembered the stories surrounding the crown. "You remind me of her," he finally said. Claire looked at him surprised. "Your mother was an Omega?" Alexander nodded. "Yes. Many believe she was too gentle to stand beside a king. They were wrong." Claire lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of those words. She understood what it meant to be underestimated because of a label. "People often confuse gentleness with weakness," she said. "They forget that it takes strength to stay kind when the world gives you reasons not to." Alexander looked at her with quiet admiration. That was the reason he had brought her to Ravencrest Castle. Not because she needed protection, but because she possessed something rare. A strength that could not be measured by rank or reputation. Later that evening, Claire entered the royal healing chamber after hearing that several villagers from nearby lands needed assistance. She spent hours helping them, refusing any special treatment for herself. When Alexander arrived, he found her sitting beside an elderly villager, offering comforting words and a warm smile. The scene stayed with him. The entire kingdom admired his authority, but Claire had earned something different: trust. The next morning, rumors began spreading through the castle. The mysterious Omega from Silver Moon Pack had captured the attention of the Shadow King. Some nobles questioned the decision. Others whispered that an Omega without a pureblood name could never represent the kingdom. Claire heard those whispers, but this time they did not break her. She had already survived the moment when the world told her she was not enough. She knew better now. Yet she did not realize that those who doubted her were only preparing for the moment when Alexander would make his choice known before the entire kingdom. The whispers that filled Ravencrest Castle grew louder with each passing day. Claire Whitmore had learned to ignore the quiet conversations that followed her through the halls, but she could not ignore the change in the way people looked at her. Some looked with curiosity, some looked with doubt, and some looked as if they were waiting for her to prove them wrong. Claire understood. She had lived in that same world before. A world where people decided someone's worth before knowing their heart. But this time she refused to let those opinions define her. 1 week after her arrival, a royal gathering was announced. Noble families from across the Northern Territories would visit Ravencrest Castle to discuss future alliances. Everyone knew the gathering had another purpose. They wanted to see the woman who had caught the attention of Alexander Ravencrest. When Claire entered the grand hall beside Alexander, the room became quiet. She felt every pair of eyes watching her. Years ago, that kind of attention would have made her want to disappear. But now she stood calmly, wearing a simple silver gown chosen by the castle seamstresses. She did not need to look like someone else. She only needed to be herself. Among the guests were familiar faces from Silver Moon Pack. Claire's heart paused when she saw Ethan Blackwood and Victoria Ashford enter the hall. Ethan looked different from the man who had walked away from her. There was uncertainty in his expression now. Victoria, however, carried the same confidence as before. She looked at Claire with surprise, as if she could not understand how the Omega she dismissed had reached this place. Ethan approached carefully. "Claire." She turned toward him. "It has been a long time." He looked around the hall, then back at her. "I did not expect to see you here." Claire gave a calm smile. "Neither did I." There was no anger in her voice, no desire to hurt him with words. That seemed to surprise him more than anything. "You seem different," Ethan said quietly. Claire looked toward Alexander, who stood nearby speaking with the council. "I think I finally stopped trying to become someone others wanted me to be." Ethan lowered his gaze. For the first time he seemed to understand what he had lost. But before he could say anything else, Victoria stepped forward. A position beside the Alpha King requires more than kindness, she said. A Luna must represent tradition and bloodline. The hall became silent. Claire looked at her, remembering the same kind of words from her past. But this time they did not create a wound. They only reminded her of how far she had traveled. A kingdom is built by more than a name, Claire replied gently. It is built by the people who protect it, serve it, and care about those who have no voice. Several nobles exchanged thoughtful glances. Before anyone could respond, Alexander stepped forward. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. That is exactly why she stands here. His voice was calm, but every person listened. Power without compassion creates distance. A crown without understanding becomes empty. Alexander looked at Claire, and his expression softened. The person who stands beside a king should not be chosen because of what they inherit. They should be chosen because of what they bring to the world. Claire felt her breath catch. For years she had heard why she was not enough. Now, in front of the same kind of people who once judged her, someone finally spoke about what she had always carried inside. But the greatest surprise came later that night, when Alexander revealed a secret hidden for generations. A secret connected to Claire's forgotten family history. A secret that would change how the entire kingdom saw the Omega they once overlooked. The secret hidden within Claire Whitmore's family history was revealed in the quiet halls beneath Ravencrest Castle. It was not a place filled with gold or royal treasures. It was an old library, where generations of the kingdom's history rested inside ancient books and forgotten records. Alexander Ravencrest walked beside Claire through the candlelit room, carrying a small wooden box that appeared ordinary at first glance. My advisors found this among the records of your family, he said. Claire looked at the box with uncertainty. My family was never important. Alexander opened it carefully and removed a faded piece of parchment. That is what everyone believed. Claire read the words written across the page, and her expression slowly changed. The record spoke of her ancestors, not as a forgotten Omega family, but as guardians of an old healing tradition that had protected the Northern Territories for generations. Her family had never been powerless. Their strength was simply different from what the world valued. They were not warriors who won battles. They were healers who saved lives. Claire touched the parchment gently. Why was this hidden? Alexander looked toward the quiet shelves around them. Because history is often written by those who hold the most power. Some people feared a gift they could not control. Claire remained silent, thinking about every moment she had been called ordinary. Every time someone told her that being gentle meant being weak. Suddenly those memories felt different. They were not proof that she had failed. They were proof that the world had never truly understood her. The following morning, Alexander invited Claire to stand beside him before the royal council. The announcement was expected to be about political alliances, but the king had something else in mind. The great hall filled with nobles from across the kingdom. Among them stood Ethan and Victoria, watching carefully. Alexander stepped forward. For many years, people believed strength came only from bloodlines, titles, and influence. But a kingdom survives because of compassion, loyalty, and courage. The room became silent. Today, I recognize Claire Whitmore not because of her family history, but because of who she has always been. Claire looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She helped people when no one was watching. She showed kindness when the world gave her reasons to become cold. That is the strength I value. The words reached every corner of the hall. For years, Claire had stood in places where people questioned whether she belonged. Now she stood beside a king who saw what others had ignored. Victoria looked away, unable to deny the truth unfolding before her. Ethan watched Claire with a quiet realization. The person he once believed was too ordinary had become someone impossible to overlook. But Claire did not feel like she had one. She did not need revenge. She did not need anyone to suffer so she could feel worthy. She simply felt peaceful. Later that evening, she walked through the castle gardens with Alexander beneath the moonlight. "Do you ever regret choosing me?" she asked softly. Alexander looked at her with a calm certainty that made her believe every word. "No. I regret that the world made you question your own worth for so long." Claire smiled, feeling the weight of her past finally becoming lighter. But beyond the northern borders, news of the king's choice was spreading. And those who once dismissed Claire were beginning to realize that the quiet Omega they overlooked was about to become the most important person in the kingdom. The days following Alexander Ravencrest's announcement brought a new feeling to Ravencrest Castle. It was not the excitement of a celebration or the noise of a victory. It was something quieter. A change that moved through the kingdom slowly, one person at a time. The people who once believed in Omega could never stand beside a king began to see Claire Whitmore differently. Not because of a title, not because of a hidden family record, but because of the way she treated everyone around her. Claire continued visiting villages across the northern territories, just as she had before she entered the castle. She sat with families, listened to their concerns, and offered help wherever she could. She never arrived expecting admiration. She simply arrived ready to care. Alexander often joined her during these visits, and the people noticed something they had never seen before. Their king, a man known for his distance and seriousness, was different when Claire was beside him. He listened more. He smiled more. He looked less like a ruler standing above his people and more like someone standing among them. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Claire and Alexander returned to the castle gardens. "Do you ever miss the life you had before?" Alexander asked. Claire thought about the small village where she had found peace after leaving Silver Moon Pack. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not because I want to return to the past, but because that version of me survived things I never thought I could." Alexander looked at her quietly. She was stronger than she knew. Claire smiled. Maybe. But she was also tired of being invisible. Alexander stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "Then I hope you know this. You will never be invisible here." Those words stayed with Claire. For so long, she had believed being chosen meant someone else had finally given her value. But now she understood something different. She had value before anyone recognized it. Meanwhile, news of Claire's growing influence reached Silver Moon Pack. Ethan Blackwood heard stories about the woman he once left behind. He heard how the villagers respected her, how the Northern Kingdom trusted her, how Alexander Ravencrest openly valued her wisdom. For the first time, Ethan understood that he had mistaken rarity for worth. He had believed a pureblood name represented greatness, but Claire had shown him something he never expected. A person's heart could leave a stronger legacy than a family name. Victoria Ashford also heard the news. The confidence she once carried began to fade as she realized Claire had never been competing with her. Claire had not taken her place. She had created her own. When Ethan finally returned to Ravencrest Castle seeking a meeting, Claire agreed to see him. They stood in the same garden where she and Alexander had shared their first honest conversation. Ethan looked at her with regret. "I thought I was choosing the better future," he said quietly. Claire listened without anger. Everyone chooses based on what they understand at the time. Ethan lowered his eyes. "And I did not understand you." Claire looked toward the castle towers glowing beneath the evening sky. "No. You understood only what the world told you to see." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. Ethan realized then that the greatest difference between them was not her new title or her connection to the king. It was that Claire had moved forward without needing anyone to admit they were wrong. That night, as the moon rose above Ravencrest Castle, Claire stood beside Alexander and looked over the kingdom that had once seemed impossible to reach. But she knew the journey was not about proving everyone else wrong. It was about finally accepting the truth she had carried all along. She was never ordinary. She was never forgotten. And soon, the entire kingdom would witness the moment the Omega they underestimated would take her rightful place. The morning of Claire Whitmore's Luna ceremony arrived beneath a sky painted with soft golden light. Across the Northern Kingdom, people gathered at Ravencrest Castle not because they wanted to witness a powerful ruler choose a bride, but because they wanted to see the woman who had changed the way they understood strength. Claire stood before the ancient stone hall wearing a simple white gown decorated with silver details from her family's forgotten tradition. She did not feel like someone who had finally become important. She felt like the same woman who once walked away from Silver Moon Pack with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of uncertainty. The difference was that now she knew her own worth. Alexander Ravencrest stood beside her, his presence calm and steady. The kingdom had always known him as the Shadow King, the ruler who carried the weight of countless responsibilities. But Claire knew the man behind the title. She knew the person who listened when others spoke, the person who cared about people no one noticed. As the ceremony began, the Royal Council announced the history of Claire's family and the healing legacy that had been hidden for generations. The same people who once dismissed her now listened in silence, not because her bloodline made her valuable, but because her actions had already proven who she was. Among the crowd stood Ethan Blackwood and Victoria Ashford. They watched as Claire received the respect she had once been denied. Ethan remembered the night he chose another path. He remembered believing that status and reputation mattered more than the person standing beside him. But now he understood the truth. He had not lost Claire because she changed. He lost her because he never truly saw her. When the final words of the ceremony were spoken, Alexander reached for Claire's hand. His voice carried across the hall. A true queen is not defined by the name she inherits. She is defined by the kindness she gives, the courage she carries, and the hope she brings to others. Claire looked around the room and saw faces that once judged her now filled with respect. But she did not feel the need to prove anything anymore. She had already forgiven the past. She had already found peace. Later that evening, Claire and Alexander walked through the castle gardens beneath the moonlight. The same moon that watched her leave her old life now witnessed the beginning of something new. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you stayed?" Alexander asked gently. Claire smiled as she looked toward the distant mountains. "Sometimes. But I think every step brought me here." Alexander looked at her with quiet certainty. "Then I am grateful for every step you took." Claire leaned against the garden railing, watching the lights of the kingdom below. She remembered the girl who once believed she needed someone else's approval to matter. She wished she could tell that girl one thing. You were never less because someone failed to recognize you. You were always worthy. The story of Claire Whitmore became a legend throughout the Northern Territories. Not because an Omega became a queen, but because she proved that true strength was never about power alone. It was about remaining kind when the world expected you to become cold. And beside the Alpha King who chose her not for what she could offer a throne, but for who she truly was, Claire finally found the place where she belonged.